Silver has sat in an uncomfortable middle ground inside the financial system, too industrial to be treated like gold, too monetary to be dismissed as a commodity, and that ambiguity is becoming relevant again as stress quietly builds inside bank balance sheets. At the surface, bank balance sheets still look orderly, but beneath that calm exterior, pressure is accumulating in places most depositors never see, and the way institutions are responding to that pressure is starting to ripple outward into markets that usually stay peripheral, including silver. Historically, banks manage stress not through dramatic failures, but through subtle adjustments, small shifts in asset composition, liquidity buffers, and risk weighting that rarely make headlines. And right now, those adjustments are becoming more defensive in ways that suggest something is being quietly priced in. Behind closed doors, balance sheet risk isn't discussed in terms of panic, but in terms of duration mismatches, unrealized losses, and funding sensitivity, and those conversations have started to change tone in recent quarters. The first sign isn't fear, but caution, and that caution shows up in how banks treat assets that behave well when confidence erodes but don't trigger regulatory penalties, a category silver has historically drifted in and out of depending on conditions. What's different this time is not that banks are suddenly bullish on silver, but that the traditional tools they rely on to absorb stress are becoming less flexible, and that constraint is forcing institutions to reassess what actually works when volatility doesn't go away quickly. At the core of the issue is duration risk, a technical problem with very real consequences where assets locked in at yesterday's yields collide with today's funding realities, creating balance sheet tension that can't be resolved without trade-offs. As interest rate environments shifted faster than many models anticipated, banks found themselves holding assets that behave perfectly on paper but poorly under mark-to-market pressure, and while those losses can remain unrealized, they still shape behavior. That behavior change matters, because when banks stop optimizing for yield and start optimizing for optionality, they quietly alter the ecosystem that supports everything from credit creation to asset pricing, and silver sites closer to that shift than most investors realize. This isn't about a return to some nostalgic monetary role for silver, but about how institutions react when liquidity becomes conditional rather than assumed, and that distinction is where the spotlight begins to move. Another layer of stress is emerging on the liability side, where deposits are no longer treated as stable, inert funding, but as mobile capital that responds to incentives and fear with equal speed, forcing banks to think defensively. When deposits can leave overnight and funding costs reprice quickly, balance sheets lose the luxury of patience, and assets that once made sense over a long horizon start to look fragile in the short term. In that environment, banks gravitate toward instruments that don't depend on counterparties behaving perfectly, assets that hold value without requiring trust in the system functioning smoothly at all times. Silver doesn't solve these problems directly, but its behavior during periods of institutional caution makes it relevant again, not as a primary reserve, but as a signal embedded in broader positioning. The market rarely waits for official acknowledgement of stress and instead reacts to how institutions hedge, rebalance, and quietly step away from exposure, and those moves tend to surface first in less crowded corners. That's why watching silver now isn't about predicting a crisis, but about reading the early language of balance sheet adaptation, a language banks speak long before the public hears it. Regulatory frameworks add another layer of complexity because capital rules in similar adjustments that collectively shift market dynamics in subtle ways. Those shifts are easy to miss if you're watching headlines, but they become obvious if you're watching flows, spreads, and the quiet repricing of risk across asset classes. Silver's recent reappearance in these conversations isn't loud or promotional, but it's persistent, and persistence is usually the first sign that something structural is changing. What's unfolding isn't a narrative of collapse, but one of constraint, where banks are learning the limits of balance sheet elasticity under new conditions, and those limits are reshaping preferences. As those preferences evolve, assets that thrive on stability lose their appeal, while assets that tolerate uncertainty without complex dependencies regain relevance, even if reluctantly. The spotlight on silver isn't coming from enthusiasm, but from necessity, and that distinction makes all the difference in how this story develops next. At the institutional level, stress doesn't announce itself through defaults or failures, but through hesitation, and that hesitation is becoming visible in how banks approach liquidity management under increasingly tight conditions. Liquidity used to be a background assumption, something balance sheets were built around rather than defended, but that assumption is weakening as funding windows shorten and confidence becomes more episodic than continuous. When liquidity shifts from abundant to conditional, banks stop asking how much return an asset generates and start asking how quickly it can be converted, repositioned, or neutralized without triggering secondary damage. That shift changes the hierarchy of assets inside the system, quietly demoting instruments that rely on deep, stable markets and elevating those that retain value, even when trading becomes fragmented. Silver enters this discussion not because, it's liquid in the same way government bonds are, but because it behaves independently when traditional liquidity channels tighten, a trait institutions don't advertise but do notice. What's happening now resembles previous periods where balance sheet stress didn't cause immediate crises, but forced banks to operate with narrower margins for error, reducing tolerance for complexity. Complexity is expensive when volatility persists because every layered exposure introduces another point of failure, and banks have become more sensitive to that reality as stress tests collide with real-world behavior. As portfolios are simplified, assets that don't require constant hedging or continuous market access quietly gain appeal, not as core holdings, but as stabilizers in an unstable environment. This doesn't show up in quarterly reports as a dramatic reallocation, but in marginal decisions, small changes in how risk desks allocate attention and capital buffers. Those marginal decisions matter because systemic shifts are almost always built from incremental moves rather than sweeping changes, and silver tends to surface early in that process. Another pressure point is collateral quality, a subject that sounds technical but dictates who can transact with whom during periods of uncertainty. As collateral standards tighten, not officially but practically, banks find that some assets no longer function as smoothly in secured funding markets, even if they remain solvent on paper. That friction forces institutions to reassess what counts as dependable collateral when counterparties become selective, and reliability starts to outweigh yield or sophistication. Silver doesn't replace traditional collateral, but its role as an asset without embedded credit risk makes it relevant when counterparties scrutinize every link in the chain. The more stress concentrates around trust rather than solvency, the more valuable assets become that don't depend on institutional credibility to function. This is where silver's hybrid nature becomes useful, not as a solution, but as a he. Silver's appearance in these contexts is rarely highlighted, but it shows up in the margins where positioning reflects mindset more than strategy. That mindset is shifting from growth to durability, and durability favors assets that don't rely on continuous market affirmation. As that shift continues, the gap between what markets price and what institutions prepare for begins to widen. Silver often sits in that gap, moving ahead of consensus not because it predicts outcomes, but because it responds to preparation. The real story isn't in price spikes, but in the slow, steady reclassification of what counts as useful under stress. And that reclassification is still underway, with consequences that extend beyond any single asset. Behind closed doors, the conversation has started to shift from managing risk to managing perception, a subtle but critical transition that changes how balance sheets are constructed. Banks understand that markets don't just react to numbers, they react to stories embedded in those numbers, and in stressed environments, the wrong story can move faster than the right one. That awareness pushes institutions to favor positions that are easier to defend, explain, and justify under scrutiny, even if they aren't optimal under benign conditions. Assets that introduce interpretive risk, where valuation depends on assumptions,